In the spring of 1961, excitement was palpable in southwestern New Hampshire for the concept of Steamtown, USA, a grand museum and tourist attraction based around the memory and legacy of steam railroading.
The hand of Nelson Blount was at last on the throttle of the standard gauge mainline steam locomotive. In fact, he eventually came to possess well over 50 old-time steam engines.
F. Nelson Blount, millionaire entrepreneur and owner of the largest private collection of steam locomotives in the world, had begun preludes with the state of New Hampshire about building an attraction in the city of Keene. Preliminary discussion with both the state and the city were proving promising, with both groups outlining various funds and ways they could support Nelson's project. The idea was to build the Steamtown site near Keene and operate passenger excursion trains with Nelson's Monadnock Steamtown and Northern Railroad, using the Boston and Maine Railroad's Cheshire Branch line between Keene and North Walpole, New Hampshire. Unfortunately, in early 1961, it became clear that the Boston and Maine Railroad's labor agreements would only allow Boston and Maine crews to operate trains on the Cheshire Branch, therefore blocking Nelson's employees from operating their own trains. Although discussion for the museum was in the very early stages, Nelson was banking on starting passenger excursion rides as soon as possible, both to build public interest and find support in establishing Steamtown, USA in the area. And so by April 1961, he was in a predicament. With the Cheshire Branch out of the question for the 1961 passenger season, Nelson began to search for alternatives. As would be the case with many endeavors in the early era of steam preservation, Nelson's party scrambled to make something work as quickly as they could. The answer came to the northeast, the tracks of the Claremont and Concord Railway in the beautiful Lake Sunapee region of New Hampshire. Richard Gassett, who later worked for the Green Mountain Railroad alongside several veterans of Nelson Blount's operations, recounted how the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern ended up so far north at Lake Sunapee in 1961.
Nelson realized that Samuel Pinsley, who owned the independent short line Claremont and Concord Railway in New Hampshire, had his office at 150 Causeway Street in Boston, where the Boston and Maine's offices were. So, after a meeting with the B&M, he got the bright idea of stopping by Sam Pinsley's office and negotiating with him. And that's how they ended up on the Claremont and Concord that year. It wasn't until 1962 that they were able to finally negotiate on B&M's Cheshire Branch in Keene.
The small crew set to work with the enormous task of starting a standard gauge steam excursion railroad essentially from the ground up. Assistant Superintendent Bob Ashcroft and Nelson Blount were both strong personalities and often butted heads to later amusement.
Nelson and I were the same age. We were very much alike. I'm as outspoken as he was, and quite often going to work in the morning, Bob Adams would say, "Will you stay the hell away from Nelson today so we can get something done in the office?" Nelson was a funny guy. We were doing work over there at North Walpole and didn't have an air compressor. You had to have a compressor if you were doing boiler work. You need a lot of air. We needed something with 100 or 125 cubic feet a minute. There's a fellow who worked down in Keene, and he was a general manager of a machine shop. He called me one day and said, "Bob, we're going to be selling a couple big air compressors. Are you interested?" Nelson was away on one of his trips, so I bid $600. A couple of days later, Nelson came back, and the bookkeeper said to him, "Nelson, we have got to have some more money." And he blew his top. "Gee, I was just here 3 days ago. I brought you up a check for $3,000. What did you do with it?" She said, "Well, I paid some bills and did this and that, and Ashcroft bought an air compressor." His hands went up in the air and he came storming out. We had some great arguments at different times. Robert Ashcroft.
Despite those arguments, the Monadnock Steamtown in Northern had a respected leader in Nelson Blount. Robert Adams later recalled working for Nelson in those early days.
Blount changed a lot, of course. I was his first employee here in this area. I came on his payroll first on April 1st, 1961. I saw a lot of changes in him. You'll find a lot of comments, sometimes adversely, about when Nelson got religion, but there was definitely a good side to that from what I saw. He was a much easier man to work for after than I think he was before. He was more tolerant as time went on. The religion aspect did that for him, if nothing else.
It becomes interesting now. I read this Bible time and time and time again. Every time I do, I get something fresh and different that I didn't get before to add up some of the things that have still bothered me, you see. That's when things happen. It isn't just going through a lot of rigmarole and say, "Yeah, I went to church, I've done what I've had to do now, I'm going, that's behind me now, let's get on to the next thing." It isn't that. It's wanting and meaning it.
He quoted a verse.
Nelson had become a deeply devoted Christian following the recovery of his wife, Ruth, who had been severely injured in a wintertime car accident in Groton, Massachusetts in January 1959. Nelson Blount was hurriedly preparing his Plan B on 13 miles of the independent short-line Claremont and Concord Railway between Bradford, New Hampshire and Sunapee, New Hampshire, to the tranquil Lake Sunapee region. Prior to 1954, the tracks had belonged to the Boston and Maine Railroad as their Claremont branch. Canadian National X10A 464T steam locomotive, number 47, the only steam locomotive rostered by the Monadnock Steamtown in Northern at the time, was selected for the job. A tank engine, built in September 1914 by the Montreal Locomotive Works for the Grand Trunk Railway as their number 1542, number 47 was transferred to the Canadian National upon their acquisition of the Grand Trunk in 1923. By 1961, number 47 had only recently been retired by the Canadian National in Montreal, where it had powered commuter trains most of its life, before it was sold to Nelson Blount on June 17, 1959, for $2,000. On October 18, 1960, a follow-up letter from Canadian National Railways stated the following about Nelson's new locomotive, number 47. In regard to number 47, I regret that the unit worksheets have been disposed of, and our mechanical department is unable to say which individual parts were repaired or renewed at the last shoppings. As mentioned in our conversation, the mileage on this locomotive since the last retubing, as of May 1957, was 50,284 miles, that last retubing being in October 1953. Here again, records are not available to show what mileage was operated on this unit after May 1957. I can only suggest that the additional miles would be small, since by that date we were rapidly dieselizing, and the extent of steam operations had diminished quite drastically. In time, that lack of complete paperwork and maintenance dates included in the purchase would prove to be a major issue for the Monadnock Steamtown in Northern. After arriving in the United States, number 47 went along with much of Blount's collection to the Engine City exhibit at Pleasure Island Amusement Park in Wakefield, Massachusetts. Of the 6 X10A locomotives owned by Canadian National, number 47 would soon be the only example to ever operate in the United States. On June 10th and 11th, 1961, the Boston and Maine hauled number 47, several former B&M wooden coaches, and a few other pieces of Nelson Blount's equipment from Pleasure Island to North Walpole. Upon arriving at North Walpole, number 47 was prepared for operation and had its Canadian National logos painted over, in addition to receiving touched-up black paint and white trim. An annual inspection and repair report for number 47 on July 18, 1961, the first major inspection since its removal from Canadian National Service on October 29, 1958, showed that the engine was in good condition with no issues reported and was approved by Robert W. Adams. An inspection by the Hartford Steam Boiler Inspection and Insurance Company reported no major problems. 4 of the former Boston and Maine wood coaches were painted bright yellow with black roofs and were emblazoned with a large oval logo featuring illustration of Mount Monadnock reading Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern Railroad. Additional rolling stock selected for the inaugural season included an old Rutland Railroad wooden boxcar for storage, 2 wooden cabooses to house the crews, and 2 wood frame coaches from the Quebec Railway Light and Power Company. The latter 2 coaches, with their ancient wooden trucks, were not to be used in passenger service, but rather placed on sidings at Newbury and Sunapee as advertisements for the excursion trains. The wooden coaches selected to operate in the first season had been used by the Boston and Maine in work train service before being retired. Coaches Mount Sunapee and Mount Lafayette had large access doors cut into either side during their work train service days. 2 metal bars were placed horizontally across these large openings, popular places for riders to stand and snap photos while the train was on the move. These old coaches, purchased by Blount from the Boston and Maine in 1959, were initially empty from their work train service and had no seats or creature comforts whatsoever, let alone any glass in the windows. To get them ready, Robert Ashcroft and his crews had to think outside the box.
We bought a bunch of church pews over in Peterborough, and we put them in one car, and then we had folding chairs in the other one. I built these plank benches that faced out, and then we had another bench against the window. The first year we operated in New Hampshire, they said we had to have something blocking the windows, which had no glass. So we ran a 1/2-inch thin wall conduit tube inside the frames, and that was good enough. Robert Ashcroft.
The equipment was hauled by the Boston and Maine from North Walpole up their Connecticut River main line to Claremont Junction, the interchange point for the Claremont and Concord Railway. The Claremont and Concord Railway had once been the 56-mile Claremont branch of the Boston and Maine before it was sold in 1954 to Sam Pinsley, the Claremont and Concord's president. Very recently in 1960, the easternmost and seldom traveled 12 miles from West Concord, New Hampshire to Kentucky had been abandoned. A Claremont and Concord local freight still ran its way east on the Claremont branch 3 days of the week as far as Kentucky, where a remnant of another branch to Henniker was also in service for freight, as far as a coal dealer near the Hogue Sprague paper mill in West Hopkinton. In the late afternoon of Friday, July 21st, 1961, the 9-car consist set out for Bradford from Claremont Junction behind number 47, the first passage of a steam locomotive over the Claremont branch in nearly 10 years. Along the Sugar River, the train clambered through the twin-covered bridges at Wrights and Kellyville. Donald Robinson, who followed the train to flag the crossings, later reported that the engine crew had set the throttle and walked through the covered bridge ahead of the train, fearing that they might not hold the weight of number 47. After arriving at Newport, a drink for the engine came courtesy of the local fire department, after which the train set out across Main Street and stalled. The Argus Champion reported that a loss of traction because of rusty rails was the cause of a 20-minute traffic jam. Later on, when the train steamed along Mountain View Lake and Lake Sunapee, summer people and children in their pajamas tumbled out of lake cottages and houses, rubbing their eyes with bewilderment. 47 and its train made it to Bradford by 10:30 p.m., met by no less than 50 automobiles of sightseers. Bradford was to be the launching point for the season, with its postcard station and enormous wooden water tank, leftovers from the Boston and Maine steam era on the branch. There were no turning facilities at Bradford or anywhere else on the excursion route, and so number 47 faced Sunapee for the entire season. Being a commuter tank engine with no separate tender, running in reverse pulling the return trips to Bradford proved to be no issue. Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern logos were mounted on the station and water tank, and signs reading "Ride steam trains of yesteryear" beckoned to the passing summer motorist. With opening day scheduled for the very next day, Saturday, July 22nd, the hasty planning and quick change in location had left a few logistical problems unaccounted for. Hess Gates, originally of Charlestown, New Hampshire, recalled one of the less obvious issues for the new operation.
Jim Hogenkamp was one of my high school classmates, and his dad, Ralph Hogenkamp, had a sideline barbecue chicken business. Jim and I were his so-called staff. It was a good summertime job for a couple of energetic high school kids. Somehow in the summer of 1961, Ralph had made a connection with F. Nelson Blount from Dublin, New Hampshire. They needed someone to sell lunches, snacks, and beverages at their Bradford station. Ralph thought this would be a great chance, and he was hoping to sell on weekdays as well as weekends. So Jim and I were dropped off in Bradford with all the barbecue equipment and supplies, with big plans to sell hundreds of chicken dinners. Well, we did not sell many, but it was a memorable experience.
Food for the passengers was not the only problem. There could be no trains unless number 47 was fed too. And this presented two problems for Nelson Blount and the Monadnock Steamtown in Northern. Stephen Hall, a Yale student at the time, remembered one of these issues from the first time he ever saw the new steam operation.
I showed up on Sunday morning, July 23rd, and said to myself, there are two things that a steam locomotive needs, water and fuel. I don't have any fuel, but I've got a water pump. So I packed into my steel cab Jeep, and I showed up there at Bradford. Sure enough, they were having problems with both. They had arrived at Bradford hoping to water number 47 with the old water tank, which was there all right, but the valve had rusted shut and they couldn't budge it. Eventually, they did get a scuba diver to go in there and free it. Meanwhile, they're trying to bail the ocean dry with a garden hose, siphoning water from the tank into the engine. I showed up and told Nelson, hey, I've got a water pump. And he said, well, throw it aboard and get on. So I set my pump into the combine and got a free ride out of that.
Coaling the locomotive presented another interesting problem. Bradford had a weed-choked freight siding that left the branch south of the station and water tank. It ran north about 600 feet along the tree line and terminated behind the station. The freight siding was depressed with a wooden retaining wall where boxcars and flat cars were unloaded at standing height. This allowed the coal bunker on number 47 to be accessed significantly easier, as Steve Hall recounts.
They built up a small ramp with a bunch of old ties, and they brought in a high-lift coal truck, but still couldn't reach the damn thing. They had to dump the coal on the footplate in front of the firebox, and then load it into the bunker.
Eventually, a conveyor belt was used and eased the loading process. Coal was supplied by the Warner Fuel Company from nearby Warner, New Hampshire. To get the coal to the conveyor, the motley Monadnock Steamtown in Northern utilized an antique 1912 autocar fuel truck.
Every time I got that truck loaded and started down through the yard, everybody was over there taking pictures of the train and then decided to take pictures of me in that weird-looking truck. We had to build the coal bin, and at that time all the sawmills up there were cutting hardwood. We went up and found a guy who had 3,000 feet of 2.5-inch maple. It was the only thing I could find that was reasonable, so we bought it. Blount jumped all over me the next day saying, "What are you buying maple for?" I said, "That's all they got up here. We got a good deal." I forget now where I bought it for, but I got it, and we built the coal bin. Then Nelson wanted to line it, and he said he would go buy the lumber, and he came back with oak, which cost him a lot more. But we didn't need to buy any blocking for derailments for the next 10 years. We just kept sawing that up. Robert Ashcroft.
Ironically, almost exactly 47 years old in 1961, number 47 was still a relatively modern machine and performed admirably.
Nelson was not always there, but when he was, he dominated the scene. He quickly reminded me of a wild high school kid who just got his first car. Except, it was a huge, soot-puffing steam engine with a screaming whistle.
Opening day, July 22nd, 1961, was a gala day in the Sunapee region. Although the steam train was the main attraction, there was also a diesel-powered fan trip operated by the Claremont and Concord for the children in a nearby hospital. To describe the scene as bedlam would be putting it mildly. Each engine had to run around its train, automobiles vied for parking spaces, and people were simply everywhere. Reporters from newspapers, wire services, television, and radio, along with amateur photographers, recorded the event. Many a passing driver did a double take upon catching the sight of engine number 47 and its 4 yellow coaches. At 11:10 a.m., the first train began to move, inaugurating what was expected to be regular steam operations until the end of October. And so F. Nelson Blount's Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern finally began its standard gauge journey into history. On its most scenic stretch, the excursion trip skirted Lake Sunapee between Newbury and Sunapee State Beach, passing close by lakeside homes, access roads, and private communities. Although Lake Sunapee was not nearly as gentrified then as it is today, the absence of steam power and the sporadic diesel-powered Claremont and Concord freights had created an air of ignorance in the area, as Hess Gates recalled.
Opposition to the excursion rides quickly became very vocal, spearheaded by Lakewood Manor. They looked for any possible way to shut down the steam train. My vague recollection was this kind of spurred Nelson to blast that whistle longer and puff as much soot as possible.
Perhaps adding to that opposition was the schedule, which was busy. During the week, there were 2 round trips, each lasting 2 hours. Train number 1 departed Bradford at 11 a.m. and returned as train number 2 at 12:59. Train number 3 departed Bradford at 2 p.m. and returned as train number 4 at 4 o'clock. The train could also be boarded during the week at alternative locations. These stops were located at Newbury, Sunapee State Park, and Mount Sunapee. The schedule on weekends was appropriately busier, with 4 total round trips. Newbury tickets were sold in Larson's General Store at the harbor, and passengers boarded just by the New Hampshire Route 103 crossing. The diesel-powered Claremont and Concord railway freights ran Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, departing Sunapee Depot eastbound at 9 o'clock a.m. and arriving at Bradford at 9:35. After switching in Bradford was done, the train departed westbound at 10 o'clock a.m., reaching Sunapee Depot at 10:45, and then continued on to Claremont, before the first daily Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern train had even left Bradford. Merrimack Farmers Exchange and the former freight house across from Bradford Station still received freight carloads of feed. The occasional longer freight trains ran to Kentucky and West Hopkinton, usually consisting of little more than a few carloads of coal. Those longer runs to Kentucky had to work around the excursion schedule. In addition to the regular schedule, there was one charter trip that ran all the way into downtown Newport. As part of Newport's bicentennial celebration, retailers in Newport gave away passenger tickets for the special trip. The train departed for Newport at 3:30 p.m. on August 17th, returning to Bradford at 5:45. This is the only known run outside of the regular operating area of Bradford to Sunapee. When the train wasn't running, the employees of the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern made memories, ones that were still fresh for Hess Gates.
At the end of the day, after the last train trip, there was not a whole lot to do in downtown Bradford for 4 young guys. One of the firemen said, "Let's go to the movies in Newport." Great idea, except no one had a car. No problem, we'll take the handcar. So we 4 jumped on the handcar and headed off to Newport, pumping and pumping, taking turns, as we traveled uphill through the Newberry Cut. We got to see the movie, not memorable, and then in the dark with no lights, jumped on the handcar headed back to Bradford. We must have been going 60 miles per hour in the pitch black when we got to the bottom of Newberry Cut, heading into Bradford. Very exciting if you do not think about what could have happened if we left the tracks.
Robert W. Adams recounted a similar tale to Richard Gassett.
They were camping out in the cabooses there in Bradford, New Hampshire during the week, and there was only one diner close by, so on a Saturday night, they'd take the motor car out from Bradford to Newport where they could get a better meal at a bigger restaurant. There were other times when it was hot and humid where they would stop on their way back to Bradford and go skinny dipping in Lake Sunapee.
The train was popular, but some advertising and press coverage had incorrectly listed North Walpole as the terminal. Most trips during the week required only 2 or 3 of the coaches. Nelson was positive, though, and stated that, if warranted, the operation out of Bradford might continue the following year, possibly as a second location in addition to the Cheshire branch operations which were still planned. As August drew on, word spread and ridership picked up. The excursions settled into a steady routine. A small selection of items from the Edaville gift shop were available at the ticket office, and on the train, sold by the soda and popcorn boys. Unfortunately, an issue soon arose which would spell an early end for the 1961 season. Locomotive number 47 was in good condition and passed inspections, both by the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern and by the Hartford Steam Boiler Inspection Company, prior to the start of the season. However, much of the locomotive's original maintenance paperwork had been disposed of when the locomotive was retired, and this had been noted by the Canadian National letter sent to Blount back in October 1960. Despite having no serious operating issues, that lack of prior documentation made the locomotive inoperable per federal regulations. The locomotive was ordered out of service by Interstate Commerce Commission Inspector John D. Wilkie at 4:00 p.m. on Friday, August 25, 1961. The Monadnock Steamtown and Northern's inspection report from July 18, 1961, before the start of the season, was missing the prior maintenance dates of 4 items on the locomotive. The reason these items were missing is because the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern did not have the old paperwork from the Canadian National. Since the locomotive had not operated between its retirement in 1958 and its reactivation in 1961, the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern believed that the Canadian National's extension on those maintenance items had not expired, and therefore were deemed unnecessary and left blank on their 1961 report. In the wake of the shutdown of number 47, Nelson Blount, the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern, and the Canadian National all attempted to locate the missing maintenance paperwork. Canadian National reached out to the Board of Transport Commissioners of Canada, who did turn out to have extra copies on file. The copies, which were then sent to Nelson Blount, did have the missing maintenance dates. Unfortunately, the report also mentioned that the locomotive had been due for retubing on December 29, 1957. But the Canadian National had been granted an extension of 12 months. When that extension expired in December 1958, the locomotive, no longer needed in a dieselized world, was retired by the Canadian National without ever being retubed. Put simply, even though the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern now had the missing paperwork showing the missing maintenance dates, those same documents revealed that the locomotive would need to be retubed before it could be put back into service. For the past 60-plus years, the commonly held story behind number 47's removal from service in 1961 is that the locomotive's maintenance records had been lost in a fire in Canada, presumably the massive 1948 Bonaventure Yard fire in Montreal. While it is possible that such a fire destroyed some documentation for number 47, a fire of any sort is never mentioned in communication between the Canadian National, the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern, and the Board of Transport Commissioners. The lost in a fire story was likely passed along by word of mouth over 6 decades, and can be easily disproven when reviewing documents which turned out to very much exist. First, the BTC report, which surfaced in September 1961 after 47's shutdown, reveals that documentation had been kept on the locomotive until it was retired by the Canadian National in 1958. The Bonaventure Yard fire in 1948 and number 47's retirement in 1958 were 10 years apart. Obviously, the locomotive could not have gone that long in revenue commuter service without maintenance and documentation. Second, the BTC report shows that copies of the needed documentation were available and not completely lost. They were just no longer held by the Canadian National, who specifically mentioned in October 1960 to Nelson Blount that their copies had been, quote, disposed of upon retirement. In fact, the missing master copy of Canadian National's inspection report for number 47 was discovered in the private collection of Russell Munro Jr. in 2021. This document, among the Canadian National's disposed of paperwork, was given to Russell when he went on a trip to Montreal in 1958. The Canadian National, never thinking the locomotive would run again, gave the paperwork away. Therefore, due to the lack of any mention of a fire in the documents which later proved to exist, the fire story is a misconception and was not the reason for number 47's removal from service in August 1961. One can't help but wonder whether Nelson Blount would have bothered to operate or even purchase number 47 if the Canadian National had kept their copies, noting that the locomotive would need retubing. The absence of these documents, in fact, may have given number 47 its last chance to stretch its legs. At the risk of igniting another fire, let us leave that to speculation. Frustration was mounting for Nelson. Already having had to adjust his excursion plans from North Walpole to Bradford, he attempted to negotiate with Washington while the 14 employees, including Clyde Sessions, Donald Robinson, and a dog mascot, picketed the New Hampshire State House with signs reading, "Save our jobs and save the steam train." Back at Bradford, a petition was drawn up. Number 47 was placed on the siding with a large sign reading, "Here I sit, for no good reason. Could have run right through the season. I'm sorry to disappoint you so, but the ICC states I cannot go. I've passed my tests and all agree there's nothing at all wrong with me. Please help us to restore my pride and sign the petition we have inside." When JFK and his brother Bob receive this card, their heads will nod. Then I'll be able to build up steam, I'll be okayed, my record's clean. I'll blow my whistle loud and clear, so all my friends over will hear. I'll give you rides at my old pace, and put that diesel here in my place. In the end, the efforts did not reverse the ICC's decision. After a week of no excursions, a General Electric 70-ton diesel from the Claremont and Concord briefly took over, pulling 2 of the coaches. However, without the allure of steam, ridership was light. Diesel-powered trains ran 3 trips a day for only 7 days total, 3 days on Labor Day weekend and the following 2 weekends, until September 17th, 1961, when the last run was made. The steam operation had lasted only 35 days, the entire 1961 season only 41. New Hampshire's lucrative fall foliage months had not even arrived. Nearly as quick as it had come about, the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern's first season on the tracks of the Claremont and Concord came to an end. Rather than having number 47 retubed and having new documents drawn up for the locomotive, Nelson decided to devote his time and resources to preparing former Rahway Valley 280 number 15 for the originally planned Cheshire branch operations. Summer was ending, and as the weather cooled, negotiations with the Boston and Maine resumed on the Cheshire branch, which had been Blount's original intention all along. Blount's equipment was towed back to Claremont Junction, and then taken by the Boston and Maine down the Connecticut River main line back to North Walpole. In 1964, the Claremont and Concord ended freight service to Bradford, pulling up their tracks between Bradford and Newport along Lake Sunapee. Around the same time, New Hampshire Route 114 was relocated, slicing right through the location of the Bradford station and water tank. The city of Keene, New Hampshire in 1962 was far from the charming quiet of Bradford and Lake Sunapee. Although diminished considerably from its earlier days as a rail mecca, the Elm City was still a relatively busy point on the Boston and Maine. It was the junction of 2 branch lines, the Cheshire branch from South Ashburnham, Massachusetts to Bellows Falls, Vermont, and the Ashwillet branch from Dole Junction to Keene. The Cheshire branch had once been an important artery for freight, passenger, and milk trains, but financial trouble for its interchange partner, the Rutland Railroad at Bellows Falls, had seriously limited traffic levels. The end of Boston and Maine passenger service in 1958 had dealt another blow to the Cheshire branch, and so the once great line became a second-rate branch line. Local freight trains still used the Cheshire, as did a milk train operating between Boston and Bellows Falls. Keene itself still retained 2 railroad yards. In town, the Keene switcher worked the yard and the local customers, and the Ashwillet branch local had work to do in Keene as well. However, freight traffic levels had declined to a point where a tourist passenger train could be feasibly worked into the schedule and not create a headache for the Boston and Maine. With the brief diversion on the Claremont and Concord Railroad finished, the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern worked through the winter of 1961 and into the spring of 1962 to prepare equipment for its grander and more involved second season. The Boston and Maine was able to work with its unions to allow Blount's non-union employees to operate their own trains on the Cheshire branch without Boston and Maine involvement. The B&M also subsequently drafted an operating agreement for the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern to operate in the Keene area. A public hearing was scheduled for March 21, 1962. The public would be addressed on the museum, with Blount himself present to describe his plans and summarize the open discussions with the state of New Hampshire that had been taking place since 1961.
New Hampshire has a $9 million program for expansion of recreation facilities. We believe that if the state finds it feasible to devote some funds to the development of a spot to show these gifts, which are priceless because they are irreplaceable, it would do itself and the rest of New England a great service. And in the end, the investment would be repaid many times over. Brattleboro Reformer, December 26, 1961.
The site believed to be the most suitable for the museum was outlined, located 2 miles west of downtown Keene, at milepost 94 on the Cheshire Branch, in the vicinity of Whitcomb Hill Road in West Keene. The Keene Sentinel offered a word of warning, however, writing to the effect that although public support was impressive and state interest was encouraging, it did not guarantee final approval by the Governor's Council, and Keene would do well to stay with the Steamtown project all the way. A preliminary estimation of construction costs by Wright and Pierce of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, set the total estimated construction cost at $401,403. A final revised amount of $306,784 was determined for the construction. Not included in that total were the structures: an 11,000 square foot display building, 400,000 square foot roundhouse, covered entryway, ticket booth and shelter, railway station, a railway station at the destination, coaling tower, water tower, and turntable, were estimated at a cost of $605,000. But the numbers were now concrete, as the state of New Hampshire was willing to commit $1 million out of its $9 million recreation budget for the total construction of the site and necessary structures. Mayor Robert Mallet Jr. of Keene rallied around the effort, and on May 19th, the Keene City Council voted 14-1 to approve and commit $100,000 to support the Keene project. Although there was firm support for the opening of Steamtown, USA in Keene, there were indeed plenty of critics. A group of citizens in West Keene near the proposed site organized to oppose the project, which they believed would bring unwanted tourist traffic to the area. The most vocal critics seemed to question state funding for what they described as an entertainment project, as opposed to more traditional recreation developments. Most opponents, such as Paul Cummings, editor of the Peterborough Transcript, believed that although Keene should have Steamtown, it was the responsibility of private funds, not public monies, even though Blount had already done his part to offer his steam locomotives to the museum project. Cummings later questioned the historic importance of Steamtown and its relevance to New Hampshire. And equally staunch resistance could be found in the press as well. William S. Loeb, the acrimonious editor of the Manchester Union Leader, whose venomous columns were notorious, spewed his own rhetoric. "If the governor and director of state parks, Russell B. Toby, want to play P.T. Barnum, let them buy their own uniforms and play circus," he wrote. On June 28, 1962, after 4 solid hours of discussion, the state of New Hampshire officially voted to move forward with the Steamtown USA project in Keene, in principle. Negotiations could now officially begin past the discussion stage. State Parks Director Russell B. Tobey had previously recommended the $1 million expenditure for the Steamtown project, which had more than self-liquidating potential, according to him. Exhaustive studies had shown that the opening of the museum would result in major tourism assets for both Cheshire County and the state of New Hampshire. Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern Superintendent Robert W. Adams later recalled the extraordinary support that the project had in the Keene area.
That part of the state is historically the part that has never gotten the state support that the eastern section, with the more populated areas, Manchester and so forth, has gotten. Of course, this looked like a golden opportunity, and it would have been for that part of the Monadnock region, as they called it in the state, that something could have formed there. Locally, where the communities, people, politicians were 100% behind it, there was no question about it. When we started the operation in Keene in 1962, the support of the local people was overwhelming. It was really awesome.
Things seemed to be falling in place rapidly, and on June 29th, the long-awaited operating agreement from the Boston and Maine for the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern to operate over their Cheshire branch was finalized. Permission was granted to operate 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday, and 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. on weekends. The agreement went into effect on July 1st, with full-week operations permitted through September 14th, and weekends only during the fall season until November 4th. The Monadnock Northern's timetable from 1962 listed 9.08 miles from Keene to the runaround track at Gilboa in Westmoreland. On June 13, 1962, work was underway in North Walpole to prepare the equipment needed for the operation. Following the untimely sidelining of number 47, Nelson had concentrated on preparing the locomotive he had previously chosen for the Keene operation, 280 Consolidation Type number 15. Built in 1916 for the Oneida and Western Railroad, and later sold in 1937 to the Rahway Valley Railroad of New Jersey, the locomotive had small drive wheels, specifically geared to handle freight in the mountainous country of Tennessee. Although the grades in and out of Keene were also arduous, number 15 would perform admirably. To the tune of nearly $10,000, the locomotive was refurbished and lettered Monadnock Northern, an abbreviated name that would also appear on the official timetables for 1962 and future seasons. The locomotive's red-on-white lettering was painted by employee Donald Robinson to imitate the Boston and Maine's similar speed lettering style seen on some of their later steam locomotives. Number 15 was neatly trimmed with white paint, red windows, and white-rimmed drive wheels with a star placed in the center of each. Undoubtedly the most notable addition to the operating fleet was number 84, the Mountaineer, a former Boston and Maine diner lounge car which had previously been used by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on his trips to Campobello Island off the Maine coast. At the time in 1962, the Mountaineer was the only diner lounge car in service on an excursion railroad in the United States. This air-conditioned car would be a fine addition to all Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern trips out of Keene, allowing for elegant dining and further tapping into the rail nostalgia that Blount sought to evoke in his passengers. Though some foliage trips in 1962 did run to Westmoreland, the decision was made to stop and turn most regular excursions at the passing siding at Gilboa. For non-dining passengers, the 4 attractive yellow wood coaches from the Bradford operation were once again used. Newly purchased coach number 188, the Mount Holly, also came down for the start of the season. 2 more recently acquired Boston and Maine wooden coaches, number 148, the Mount Kilburn, and number 265, the Mount Washington, were painted yellow and brought down from North Walpole as needed. Combine car number 71 was placed on the siding at Gilboa, where it was used as a gift shop manned by either the train crew, the news and soda boys, or the dining car staff during the layovers. Alan K. Clark Sr., then a teenager living in Keene, recalls how he became involved with the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern in 1962.
My association with Operation in Keene was limited to weekends and holidays. My story begins with going to a meeting with Mr. Blount and asking him if I could work on the train, doing anything to help him make it a successful operation. His response was that he had reached his payroll budget and he could not afford to pay anyone else. He offered to put my name on a standby list in case someone dropped off the roster of employees. I told him I didn't need the money, as I had a full-time job at A.E. Martell's printing company. I offered him that I didn't need the money, but could only work weekends and holidays. His chin dropped and he had a surprising look on his face. He said that no one had ever made an offer like that. Ever. He then said, "I'll get a conductor's uniform and hat, and if I need you to sell souvenirs, would you do it?" I told him yes, and he said that would only be the case if someone didn't show up. None of the crew knew that I wasn't being paid, except for Clyde Sessions, who was second to Mr. Blount. It was a great memory for me. Yes, I did occasionally sell souvenirs, and that was fun to do.
Located in the heart of downtown Keene, the railroad yards were a perfect location for the type of patronage and publicity that Blount hoped would attract tourists and seal the deal for a permanent home in the area. Even though there were no large highways to or from Keene, good state roads in all directions provided easy access to the population center of Cheshire County. Keene's passenger station had been demolished with the end of Boston and Maine passenger service in 1958. So Blount asked the city for permission to build a small station, containing a ticket office and restrooms. This needed city approval, which could not be worked out in time, so an agreement was reached where passengers could relieve themselves in the restrooms at City Hall. A small ticket booth was planted along Gilboa Avenue, where passengers would board. Cases of glass-bottled Coca-Cola were often seen stacked alongside the small structure, ready to be loaded onto the train and hawked by the popcorn boys. Large signs once again heralded steam trains of yesteryear. The logistical question of how to fuel the locomotive was quickly resolved with Yankee ingenuity. With city permission, a fire hydrant was tapped into, with a long hose for watering the locomotive. Unlike Bradford, Keene did not have a water tower from the earlier steam era. In 1962, many Keene citizens still heated their homes with coal, and the nearby Chabot coal and oil silo had a rail siding and conveyor, where number 15 was coaled for its runs out of the city. On July 12, 1962, nearly a year after the Bradford operation started, number 15 departed the yard at North Walpole with 9 cars in tow for the Keene operation. A motor car, M1, with a trailer and small water tank followed to patrol for any fires that might have been ignited by the steam locomotive. As the proud train puffed into the Elm City with all the grandeur of a traveling show of days past, nearly 400 people came out to see the first arrival of a steam locomotive in many years, and the first that many young onlookers had ever seen. Blount had originally hoped to make the first run out of Keene on July 7th, but had to postpone the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern's arrival in Keene due to various technical issues with the equipment and the sudden illness of his mother, which called him away for several days. Finally, inaugural day arrived, Friday, July 13th, 1962. Nelson's wife Ruth later told the Brattleboro Reformer that Nelson had been like a happy boy the entire car ride up from their Dublin home that morning. An impressive 375 passengers showed up for the first run, along with countless onlookers and an extensive news presence. The Keene Summer Theater had been performing the streets of New York, and so actors dressed in 19th century garb made the ceremonies all the merrier. Keene's mayor, Robert L. Mallet Jr., cut the ribbon on the front of number 15. It was an optimistic start to what all hoped would be a permanent stay. Afterward, Blount chatted with reporters before climbing up to the throttle to guide number 15 out of Keene for the first time. Conductor Robert Triggs of Springfield, Massachusetts, a B&M employee of 48 years, punched tickets and conversed with passengers as they took in the sights, smells, and sounds of a bygone era. Upon arriving at Gilboa, passengers were granted time to browse the gift shop, purchase hot dogs, hamburgers, chicken, and other refreshments, and watch number 15 run around its train for the return trip home. Diners in the Mountaineer enjoyed an air-conditioned lunch served with food from the Crystal Restaurant. Along the Cheshire Branch clattered number 15 throughout the dog days of summer, whistle echoing off the hillsides and yellow coaches shining in the sun. If you were in West Keene, perhaps you might stumble across the stone arch at Arch Street, just in time to catch the train barreling upgrade with a friendly wave from Nelson at the throttle. An especially impressive show could be seen standing on the Route 12 overpass at Summit Cut, where number 15 could be heard for miles climbing the steep grade towards Gilboa, accompanied by the symphonic pounding of the drive wheels reverberating off the deep rock cut. Rail fans and enthusiasts packed the train and raced along Route 12, leaving us with no shortage of timeless images and film of the proud Baldwin 280 and its train. Those wishing to ride in the cab of 15 could do so for double fare on a first-come, first-served basis. The 1962 season, despite its late start in July, was proving successful and would ultimately see 14,000 passengers. However, Blount was not in town to simply run an excursion train. He had his eyes set on the museum. The real roadblock to the groundbreaking for Steamtown, USA did not surround the museum itself. The needed support both at the state and local level was already secure. It was the railroad tracks themselves that were at the heart of the issue. If the state of New Hampshire was to move forward with funding the Steamtown project in Keene, they believed that the Cheshire branch would need to be acquired from the Boston and Maine to allow for adequate maintenance and upkeep, which the B&M had not been providing and was not interested in providing. A lease agreement would simply not provide the security that the state wanted. Blount estimated that the section of railroad from Keene to North Walpole would require around $100,000 in repair for satisfactory operation. It was also believed to be unwise to move forward with such a project when the Boston and Maine could simply abandon their Cheshire branch out from under Blount in the state at any time. The B&M had no official plans to do so, but decreasing freight activity on the line was being constantly studied by the Boston and Maine. It must be noted, as recently surfaced communications pointed out, that the Boston and Maine was somewhat hesitant on selling the Cheshire branch during this process. Patrick J. Mullaney of the Boston and Maine made note that he could not recommend the sale unless a satisfactory alternative could be worked out regarding the Boston and Maine's milk trains running from Bellows Falls to Boston, a big chunk of business for the Boston and Maine, which traveled over the entirety of the Cheshire branch. The Boston and Maine had considered rerouting their milk trains down their Connecticut River line to Greenfield, Massachusetts, and then over their Fitchburg division east to Boston. They estimated the rerouting would cost them between $55,000 and $60,000, but would not affect satisfactory service. They did believe, however, it could cause labor issues on the Boston and Maine. There was also some concern among general freight customers in the Keene area that a sale of the Keene to North Walpole section of the Cheshire branch might affect rail freight service. In the event of a sale, Keene could still receive its freight up the other half of the Cheshire from Massachusetts, or up the Ashwillet branch instead. But the towns of Westmoreland and Walpole on the section in question might be cut off from Boston and Maine freight service. Both towns were still receiving occasional freight at their respective team tracks. Blount, himself a stockholder of the Boston and Maine, did not want to see any shippers or freight traffic affected, and stated that if the Keene to North Walpole section of the Cheshire branch were sold to him, he would have no issue in granting the Boston and Maine overhead rights to run their local freights. Former Boston and Maine President Patrick McGinnis had previously made, quote, definite commitments to Nelson, and had a, quote, obligation on a deal with him for the Cheshire branch. These commitments were not recognized by the Boston and Maine in 1962 after McGinnis had been ousted as president. Time was of the essence. Commissioner John Rowe of the New Hampshire Department of Resources and Economic Development stated that the legislature wanted a definitive answer on a sale of the branch to Blount before their return to session in January 1963. He would have to answer personally if the plan fell through. In mid-November 1962, the Boston and Maine directors finally authorized the sale of 22 miles of track from Keene to North Walpole and began drawing up a buy and sell agreement to present to Nelson Blount for approval. In reality, the Boston and Maine needed considerably more time to study freight rates, work out arrangements for trackage rights, and detouring traffic. 6 months was optimistic, they said. Commissioner Rowe responded that the state had already spent $45,000 to date on the project and that its success was very necessary for the economic benefit of the state and the local area. The window of opportunity for Steamtown in Keene was rapidly closing. The Monadnock Steamtown in Northern wrapped up its 1962 season in early November, and the equipment returned to North Walpole to hibernate. Negotiations did not clear up, and the foot-dragging continued. Others were anxious about the delays too. Under a column titled "Let's Get Going," the Keene Sentinel wondered aloud what had become of the project and the loose ends which, quote, should be wrapping up. With the changing of the seasons came election time and a change in the political climate in New Hampshire. More signs of trouble came when Governor Wesley Powell was voted out of office. Governor John King, sworn in on January 3, 1963, spoke to honor the prior commitments for Steamtown made by his predecessor and backed the project publicly. Unfortunately, by January, Councillor Harold Weeks, who had been the project's staunchest supporter in the State House and was responsible for motivating the state government to initially pursue the Steamtown project, no longer held office. In addition to Powell and Weeks, several other supporters had been replaced as well. With the sale agreement for the Boston and Maine's Cheshire branch still delayed, Commissioner Rowe proposed that the state of New Hampshire might pursue purchasing the railroad line instead of Blount. This idea was not well received in the public sphere. There was no precedent for state-owned railroad lines in New Hampshire in 1962 and 1963, certainly not in the manner that there would be in the 1970s and later. Tourist railroads were still a new novelty, and aside from the Cog Railway and Clark's Trading Post, not yet an established part of New Hampshire's tourist economy. The funding of a museum alone had been a tough sell. The prospect of the state also purchasing a railroad line caught fire in the press and added to the arguments of the naysayers. Nelson Blount started to direct his attention elsewhere as a contingency, even looking at the possibility of operating excursion trains in Connecticut. The situation in New Hampshire had made Blount wary, though, and he commented in a Connecticut newspaper that he didn't want a noose around his neck alone, without the security of state or local support. Alternative discussions with the state of Vermont had also started to look promising, and according to Blount, were, quote, better than the prospects in Connecticut. These discussions had begun in earnest back in September 1962 during the foot-dragging in Keene, when Blount offered to buy a section of the Rutland Railroad from Bellows Falls to Ludlow, Vermont. This would be the start of serious negotiations on what would eventually become the freight-hauling Green Mountain Railroad and the future home of Steamtown, USA and the Monadnock Northern. Though it was a possible escape from his troubles in New Hampshire, Vermont was unlikely to explore public funding the way that New Hampshire had. Blount told the Vermont Journal that Steamtown in Vermont just wouldn't be as good a museum as it would in Keene. He couldn't afford it. In one final show of goodwill and commitment to the Granite State, Nelson Blount offered his Monadnock Steamtown and Northern Railroad itself to the state of New Hampshire on February 15, 1963. Blount believed that offering the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern and its assets to the state might sweeten the pot. In the original plans, the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern was meant to be a separate entity owned and operated by Blount, the operational tourist railroad addition to the state-owned Steamtown USA Museum. However, without control of the Cheshire branch to run on, Nelson's offer of the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern was of little consequence to the state of New Hampshire. After a 4-hour-long hearing at the State House on February 16th, attended by a number of supporters, Commissioner Rowe's advisory board voted 5-1 to kill the Steamtown project. A subsequent vote by Governor John King's Executive Council also voted in opposition to the project, 3-2. Steamtown had no chance in Keene. Mayor Mallet lamented the death of the project as one of the state's worst mistakes. The Keene area desperately sought other attractions to replace Steamtown, even establishing a special committee on the project. Nothing much came of it. Today, the Keene area has minimal draw for tourist dollars. The fallout caused by the loss of Steamtown was not limited to tourism alone. In time, it seemed that Blount's offer had been the last true chance for survival of the Cheshire branch, and perhaps the railroad itself in the Keene area. Had a state-funded Steamtown USA opened in the Elm City, it's possible it would still be located there today. But Steamtown slipped away, and so did time. So passed the worldly glories. The Boston and Maine's milk train, which had proved an obstacle to the sale of the tracks themselves, last ran on July 17, 1964, less than 2 years after the end of the season. Light freight traffic and occasional oversized freight moves continued until the Boston and Maine abandoned most of their Cheshire branch in 1972, including the section in question between Keene and North Walpole. It is difficult, standing along Gilboa Avenue today, to imagine number 15 and its bright yellow coaches steaming away with admirers leaning out of the windows. As far as the railroad itself is concerned, Keene today is a ghost town. The Monadnock Steamtown Northern and Steamtown USA were its last chances at longevity. The city, which had been a major rail junction of 3 lines in its earlier days, has no rail presence left whatsoever today. The last rail access to Keene, the Ashwillet branch, was abandoned by the Boston and Maine in 1984, following a brief lease to the Green Mountain Railroad for freight operations. The Green Mountain Railroad was, ironically, itself another legacy of F. Nelson Blount.
This old town's been talking about my round town ways. Whole town's been talking about my round town ways. My wanton way of a loving, putting numbers on my days. Baby, when I met you, I was on a spree. Baby, when I met you, I was on a spree. You can get me down on my bended knee. My wanton way of a loving.